We, the members of the Secret Order of Alchemical Actors, do solemnly commit ourselves to a full and honest telling of the history of the occult as far as we know it. Well, we are back for another interview episode today, Luke. I am excited about this one. It is rare that we have someone who is both in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and an expert on the history of consciousness. Very excited for this conversation. Luke, tell us all about it.
Joining us today is Gary Lachman, writer, lecturer, and one of the few people who can claim both a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, as you said, and as having a reputation as being a leading voice on Western esotericism. After his early years as a founding member of Blondie, Gary turned his attention to questions of consciousness, symbolism, and spiritual philosophy. Today, we're going to explore his newest book, Touched by the Presence.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be on the show. I look forward to it.
And we're looking forward to this conversation with you. Now, in order to give our audience a better idea of who you were, especially prior to Blondie and prior to your diving into the occult, who was Gary Lachman?
Well, I was born Christmas Eve, 1955. I guess that makes me a boomer. And Eisenhower was president, and there were 48 states. And the first thing that had a major impact on me, I would say, is comic book. That's what I would say in the beginning of the book. In a way, you know, my quest, or whatever you want to call it, started when there was a character called Cosmic Boy, and he had magnetic powers, but I didn't understand why they didn't call him Magnet Boy. And I remember I was very logical. I'm like, why isn't he called Magnet Boy? What's cosmic? So I remember asking my sister what cosmic meant, and she didn't know. And I asked my mother, she didn't know either. I didn't bother to ask my father. So you could say I've been trying to figure that one out since I'm about 5, and that's quite some time, folks. But, you know, I mean, I grew up in New Jersey. I was, you know, pretty much a regular teenager, and I guess I came of age at the end of the 60s into the 70s, just, you know, the tail end of the hippie kind of thing. But all that do your own thing, don't conform, be who you are, become who you are. That sort of ethos still had currency, and I just kind of went for it. I swallowed it whole, and pretty much threw myself into. Well, just before I started playing in Blondie, I was actually living in New York, in the East Village, in a rundown storefront that someone had called a studio. You know. And basically, you know, just put a curtain in the front window, and then now it's a studio. Any case, and I was sharing. I mean, I can't. These are so many like crazy stories, but I was sharing with somebody who was like the wildest guy in my hometown in Jersey. But at the time we were sharing this place together, he was transitioning into being a born again Christian. It was just such a weird kind of thing. And I was living in this place and starving and writing lots of bad poetry, not consciously trying to make it bad, but it just I had a talent for writing, and it was bad. So anyway, and working as a messenger and doing all this kind of stuff, and it was just sort of by chance that I got into playing with Blondie.
Now, I can relate with you a little bit because when you were playing with Blondie, you were playing bass, and I've been a bassist for at least a good 2 decades at this point. And so as this music scene is really beginning to start and blow up in New York, this proto-punk explosion, what kind of pushed you in that direction? What moved you towards this kind of anti-establishment style? You'd mentioned in your book, you talk about the connection that you have with Clem, but aside from this friendship connection, where is your attraction to the music?
Well, I mean, I fell into a crowd of, I guess, misfits, or, you know, I don't want to use the word outsider because that doesn't, well, they were, but it was in another different way that became, you know, more of a philosophical term for me. But no, I mean, like I said, this one guy was really on the edge character, and a couple others. And we weren't deadheads. You know, we weren't into Grateful Dead or, you know, Santana, that kind of stuff. But, you know, we were kind of, you know, Lou Reed and the New York Dolls. They were a big band for me when I was still living in Jersey and in my late teens. And, you know, well, Clem was, you know, his antennae were always tuned to whatever the NBT, the next big thing. And he was hip to Bowie before really anybody else in our neck of the woods. was and all that sort of thing. So I that was like the first kind of. I mean, I grew up during the British invasion, so I grew up hearing like the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and the Zombies and all that kind of stuff. So I grew up with all that pop music in the background and Motown and all of that. But specifically, like going out of my way to go see bands, it was that kind of thing. So this was pre CBGB. It was called glam here. Well, here now that I live in London with glitter. So so we were going over from Jersey into New York, and there was an old drag club called Club 82. It's not there anymore, on East 4th Street and 2nd Avenue, that started letting bands play. And this was this whole sexual ambiguity, and everything was transgressive, although it was more fun. It wasn't very, very militant and political as it seems today, but it was just a lot of fun, dressing up and all that. And I was wearing makeup and glitter and all this kind of crap, and then going to this club and seeing, and people like Bowie and Lou Reed were hanging out there. So I was in that milieu, and what happened was that I said, I'm living in the storefront with this guy who's going off the deep end, and I taught myself how to play. This was like a broken down piano, like some of these uprights, and it was like every other key was plunk plunk, but I figure out, and you can't imagine the squalor I lived in at this time, and I lived in New York there. I mean, I had come. That's why I'm very neat now. I'm very neat and hygienic now, but I lived in squalor for such a long time, and it was just, oh my God. But you had to do that if you were a poet and all that kind of thing. And Clem, I knew, he's great. Clem Burke, great drummer, passed away earlier this year, and I knew him from high school, and there were lots of all these other great musicians that were in high school. I knew them, but I wasn't really a musician. I was hanging out with these guys, and I could pick up a couple chords here and there, but they could figure out, Hendrix licks or Yes or King Crimson and all this kind of really incredible stuff.
Something I still wish I could do.
Well, I mean, I could. It was like you had to go to the Juilliard School of Music in order to play rock and roll, and this was by the mid '70s, and there's parallel things. I mean, one thing that happened mainstream was the revival of '50s stuff. You had Shana Na, so they were doing all this doo-wop stuff that became very, very popular again, and that's one of the things remarkable. There was a nostalgia for the roots of rock and roll very quickly. It was like that's going back. It's just mid '70s or. It's going back to when? Mid 50s. So it's only 20 years. And there's like a nostalgia for the early days of rock. And then all these other guys from that time had revivals. Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, and all the other ones. They had hits again for a while and were touring, Chubby Checker. And then what was happening in New York was with the Dolls, they just played high energy 3-chord rock. And it was just fun. And it was fun to dress up. And then that kind of died out. And the next thing was CBGB opening up, but everything was stripped down and black and white, and all the glitter and glam was all gone, and it was like getting clothes from charity shops, which for me that was fantastic because I couldn't afford all the stuff. You could get some stuff from the Salvation Army or something, but I was living in the storefront, and Clem had started playing he had answered an ad in the Village Voice, and he had started playing with Chris Stein and Debbie Harry, but they kept losing the other musicians. They lost the guitarist, they lost the drummer. And the first time he played in CBGB, Clem, with them, at the end of the gig, Fred Smith, who was their bass player, said that he was leaving because he was going to join Tom Verlaine's band, Television, because Richard Hell, who invented punk rock, he was the first one with the T-shirt, he had left to start his own band. And so Clem just said, do you want to come down and see that we need a bass player? You want to come down and see, if you can audition? I had already gone to some of their gigs. And so I just wound up, and I knew enough to do A, B, and whatever, E for a while, and to figure all this. And everybody was learning how to play. That was one of the great things about that time. It wasn't fantastically finely honed, rock, which you could get at the Bottom Line or any number of other like mainstream places. This was like you were seeing it happen, in front of you. And so that was what was remarkable about it.
It makes me think of, there was another punk band, and I think they might have been in the early 80s, called the Minutemen, and they would intentionally tune their instruments just kind of based on the feeling of the string, not based off of any actual sort of tuning, and then play songs just purely on feel without having any sort of musical knowledge. And, they'd be called the Minutemen because each song would be just a quick minute of anger and frustration and rebellion. And I think that's amazing. And so it's beautiful to really think about everyone kind of coming together with this similar thought and this similar, like, you go back to what you had said where they were outsiders, but not in the way that we might describe it now, how everyone is kind of coming together under this same umbrella and creating this music. It was a super exciting period of time to hear about the development of all of these things. And then we have this huge left turn because the sound of rebellion eventually kind of moves things toward the esoteric. So I want to go into that direction, explore your move into the esoteric, kind of give us some more context there.
Well, that happened. That's what the new book is about how I went from playing in rock to, doing what I'm doing now. And more or less, it's kind of like the prequel and then the sequel. So I did do an earlier memoir called New York Rocker that's still in print. And that's specifically about that. That's all the salacious. I shouldn't say this because then the people, I'm not going to buy this other book.
Alternatively, you can just get them to buy both.
Because it doesn't have all the good stories in it. No, it has those too. It has all those sexy stories as well. In any case, so yeah, and that's called New York Rock. That came out 20 years ago. Well, the funny thing about that, because I wrote that as Gary Valentine, that was my name back then. So I had this pseudonym back then. Everybody else had names like Johnny Thunders and Richard Hell, and Ellen Suicide. They were all very angry. And I wasn't angry about anything. I thought, my God, I'm 19 years old. I'm doing exactly what I want to do. This is what everybody I knew when I was in high school wanted to do. I'm playing in a rock band in New York. And I was the last guy to think that this was going to happen too. So any case, I'm getting distracted. But no, when I was just started playing with Chris and Debbie. I went through a brief period of being homeless, and then Debbie took me in, and she had a very small 1-bedroom flat in Little Italy on Thompson Street in New York, which was a backwater then. It's a tourist, attraction now, but back then it was even Soho. It wasn't anything then in New York. And then it was a tiny place, and it couldn't last, and so we wound up getting a whole floor of a building on the Bowery, and it was this dilapidated, loft space. And the guy who had the lease was this wild gay biker artist who was into the Hells Angels, but he was also into Aleister Crowley. And he had the Thoth Tarot deck, which was relatively rare at the time. This would have been 1970, summer of 75, and then he was reading from Diary of a Drug Fiend and all this kind of stuff. And I just became interested in all that. And I didn't have any interest in magic per se, seriously, until then. I was a fan of H.P. Lovecraft and weird tales and weird fiction, that kind of thing. And I loved all the old Universal horror films from the 30s and 40s, the black and white classic ones. So I grew up reading all that stuff and watching those films. But I never took magic, sort of seriously. But he just made it interesting. And so I got interested in Crowley. But then the thing that did it for me was this book just called The Occult. It was by a British writer, Colin Wilson. And it was originally published in 71, so I was reading it in 75, so it was still fairly, recent and topical. And there had been this revival of interest in the occult and the magical starting in the 1960s. I mean, I subsequently wrote a book about this. My first book, Turn Off Your Mind, was about the occult roots of the pop culture of the 1960s and so on. And I read this book, and it was just such a page turner. So, just compelling reading, as the publisher's blurbs say, and unputdownable. But it wasn't a book just about spells and ghosts and all that kind of stuff. It had chapters on witchcraft and alchemy and a variety of other things, and all these different fantastic characters like Crowley and Gurdjieff and Baron Blavatsky and Rasputin and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and so on and so on. But he had this overview going back to like the Stone Age and then into the future and all this kind of thing. And it was this overarching kind of philosophy of consciousness that he was seeing in. And I just was bowled over by this. So that was like the thing that really kind of, the spark that started when I was 5 years old, wanting to know what cosmic meant, got kind of a real boost here and kind of like a roadmap, because if I subsequently got to know Wilson quite well, and I wrote a book about him after he died. He died in 2013. I made a pilgrimage to where he lived in Cornwall, in the far west country here in England, in 1983, and started a friendship, and not consciously a mentorship, but I sort of, I was, how should I say it? I was very much informed and influenced by his ideas, and any readableness my own writing has must come from my obsessively reading his books. I would say, so absorbing this kind of. Somebody said he could make the telephone directory compelling. So, any case, so that's what really got. I mean, it's the power of ideas. That's the thing that really got me going. It was just like I mean, before then I had read. Well, I had this fantastic teacher my last year in high school. So this would have been 1973. And 72 and 73, I guess. And he recognized that I just read everything I was reading all the time. I was a casualty of the Hermann Hesse posthumous bestsellerdom, in the late 60s and early 70s, when a hippie girl gave me a copy of Siddhartha, and then I just plunged into that, and Steppenwolf and Damien and all that kind of thing. And so this teacher recognized that I was reading all this stuff, and so he started handing me books to read, and which he would test me on. And then he taught the rest of the class the same, whatever the standard curriculum was. So he was handing me Sartre and Nietzsche, and then he was teaching the rest of the class. So I'd already had that kind of going for me. And Wilson had, I didn't know, but he had a career already writing books about existentialism and things like that, popular sort of books. So Sartre and Nietzsche's popping up, Heidegger's popping up in the midst of this book about the occult. I'm thinking, what the heck? It's like I probably couldn't pronounce Heidegger's name correctly at the point. But that's in this book I read about existentialism. What's this got to do with that? So I'm 19 years old. I'm living the life, as one would say, the dream, playing in a rock band in New York, living in this rundown loft space, with Debbie and Chris, Uncle Debbie, excuse me. Uncle Chris and Aunt Debbie and whatever in the back. And it's like, wow, this is just fantastic. And then it was a great time to get into that stuff, because all these bookstores had sections on the occult or UFOs or whatever it is, weird stuff. And there was a whole boom in publishing in that. So there was lots of stuff coming out. Plus, books that were in public domain were being put out by publishing houses, cheap editions, because they didn't have to pay writers anything. And there's a great place like Weiser's over in Cooper Union. It's not there anymore, but it was this, it was like the occult bookshop in New York. And so it just was wonderful. I just had a great time just going to all these different places and, coming back with one or two books or something and then reading more and more and more. And then what started out as a enthusiastic kind of fascination slowly over a long period of time turned into, more or less a serious kind of attempt to understand it in terms of its actual place in evolution of consciousness and in Western culture.
Gary, do you think someone who's like drawn to make rock and roll, I'm thinking David Bowie, I'm thinking Jimmy Page, is also perhaps predisposed to occult kind of thinking?
Well, I think in one way, music and what we want to call magic both have their powerful effect because they reach below the conscious mind, the critical mind. They're visceral. They reach, what you would call the unconscious, whatever it is. You can be moved by music in spite of yourself, even if you consciously don't want to be, or something like that. So I think there's that. But I think with people like Bowie and Page, what had happened is that Crowley had become adopted by the counterculture, officially in 1967, when he's on the cover of the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's album, with Aldous Huxley's on the cover as well, and Jung, and there's a couple Swamis and Edgar Allan Poe, and lots of interesting people. It's like the people we like. But if you read some of the interviews from that time, they're even saying things like, they're even mentioning him, and Lennon is talking about do what you like, that rather than do what you will, but then a lot of Crowleyites mix the two up anyway. But and he had there was like there used to be underground newspaper here in the UK called International Times, and they had like a half-page piece about rediscovering Crowley as his proto-hippie because of his interest in drugs and he was polymorphously perverse before Herbert Marcuse was telling all the student radicals to go out and do that, as a protest against, the establishment kind of thing. So he seemed like, oh yeah, God, he's doing all this great stuff back then. And then he's into magic. So again, there was this strange thing that happened in the 1960s, the early 60s, that magic became this real popular craze. And so, Page and Bowie, it's not surprising that they picked up on it, and Page got into, I think, a bit more, I don't know, seriously, but deeply. I mean, I know Bowie did as well. I mean, I tell the story in the book of one where I get thrown out of Bowie's Midtown loft in about 1980 or something like that, 81 in New York, because of an argument we have about Colin Wilson. And so, yeah, I won't tell the whole story. So there you go. There's a teaser. So I was thrust out of told to leave because I had the audacity to basically say he didn't know what he was talking about. But I didn't say in so many words. But in any case, so there you go. So these people get into these things. But it's if you see in the early days, like with the Beatles, it's a bit more mystical than magical, but they still the magical mystery tour and those kind of things. So there is all that coding. I mean, the Stones got more directly sympathy for the devil and satanic and all of that. But there's that whole history of the relationship between music, blues, and the devil, and Robert Johnson and meeting the devil on the crossroads and all that, and the devil has the best tunes and all of that. So in the rock and roll in hell, they don't up in heaven they're plucking the harps and all that kind of thing. So so there's that connection. There's that connection. But then these people get into it, I used to. There was a bookshop in Hollywood when I left New York and I left Blondie and I moved to LA to be with my girlfriend at the time, Lisa Jane Persky, who's an actress and a writer and a photographer, and many photographs never seen before have fill a 8-page photo insert in the book as well, folks. There you go. And out there, and I started my own band called The Know, K-N-O-W, and this was because of my interest in Gnosticism, in gnosis, and this kind of mystical way of knowing things. And but there was this old bookshop called Gilbert's on Hollywood Boulevard, and people like Page and Bowie, and the filmmaker Kenneth Anger, and other well-heeled sort of Crowley fans used to go there. And in fact, it was at this place where back in the days before the internet, there was an old bulletin board kind of thing. This is the sort of thing I keep thinking now there's going to be, I get a little tangential thing here. I get this feeling that there's soon going to be films like stuff like that. Is like, if you like 1984 or Soylent Green or something, where there's stuff from the before time. There's a dystopian future, but there's stuff in the before time there. And so a bulletin board, and it's all like, it's like wabi or whatever the Japanese aesthetic is. It's old and it's from the past and it's somehow, wonky. Or even now, like you go to some of these Oxfam charity shops here. That's like a big, chain of charity shops here. And they have like old and interesting, and it's just hardcover books. It's just random, whatever it is. It's just, oh yeah, that's, and I think, God, I'm like Edgar G. Robinson in Soylent Green. It's like, oh, hey, look. Ooh. In any case, that's tangential. So where was
this ancient artifact? I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. It's like it is like that. I've made a practice of scooping up any, because you get them for a couple quid or like a few pounds, and if it's some book written before 1980 when English prose is still readable, present author accepted. So I'm in this bookshop Gilbert's, and it's there. I went from the bulletin board. That's what happened. So at the bulletin board, I see an advertisement for a Crowley group, and I've been reading his books and reading books about him, and various other books about magic, and Israel Regardie's books, and lots of others. And so I figured, okay, what the heck, let's check it out. So I write them a little I get the address down and write them a letter. And a couple of days later, there's a knock at my door, and there's a very unprepossessing character in front. He asked me, "Are you ready to commit yourself to the knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel?" And I had to think about it, for a second. It was sort of like being asked to, join the Jehovah's Witnesses or something, right on the doorstep. But I figured, okay, I've been reading about this for a couple of years now, never the armchair magician. Why not? I'll go for it. And so I took the plunge. I tell the story in the book as well, but it was interesting. It turned out to be, he was one of these Crowleyites who confused do without will with do what you like. In the end, but I'm, naive, innocent, wanting to learn. I gave him the benefit of the doubt and all this kind of thing. Me and my girlfriend is saying, "What are you doing with this guy?" Kind of thing, but we got through it. And all that, and then I lost interest after a while. But that was my encounter with. But it was the OTO. I mean, I was in for a while, but there was this particular group of people in Los Angeles at a particular time, so it doesn't necessarily reflect on any other people involved in this. And I know many people in it. I've met them, and some of them are good friends, and they're all really nice people and all that. But this particular patch I was in at the time, it turned out to be an unsalubrious crowd. And then after a while, just Crowley became claustrophobic. It just was more about him than anything else. And I had taken sort of a scientific approach. I said, well, let's see what happens. I practiced these rituals. I did these sort of things. There was all the, various different, rules about not saying I and things like that. And I forget what that was called, Liber Jugorum or something like that. And you originally you're supposed to like slice yourself, but we just had a rubber band, so snap. And so, kind of conditioning.
A little cleaner that way.
Yeah. But it was, it was fun, but also after a while, I just found Crowley a bit claustrophobic, and I got just more and more interested in consciousness per se than magic. Although I tried it out. I said I had the robe and everything and all that, and I did it for a while. Had some interesting experiences, but it just led me to be more interested per se. And I was more interested in what was happening conscious to me than wanting to achieve any kind of magical effect or something like that.
So all of this is happening. This is culminating together, and eventually you start making some pilgrimages. I want to talk a little about them. You end up at Gurdjieff's Fourth Way, visiting Stonehenge and Avebury, and Gurdjieff's Institute in France. What were those physical pilgrimages like for you? How would you say that those had impacted you?
Well, it was fantastic. This was 1983, and I had more or less I dropped out of music a year or so earlier. The last my own band, we didn't land major contract. I put out a single 45, and then we put out a 45, and we did lots of shows. We were bi-coastal, but we didn't land a contract. So after a couple of years, I packed that in, and I was getting less and less interested in music anyway because I was reading so much. I was getting too smart for rock and roll, basically, but I didn't know what to do with myself. And the last thing I did was do 2 tours with Iggy Pop, and just playing like just a hired gun, like a guitarist on these 2 tours. And those are the sex, drugs, and rock and roll tours. And after that, I was living in New York at that time. I was going back and forth between LA and New York quite a bit, from like late 70s into the early 80s. And then I just went back to LA, and I had a song of mine, the song I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear, which was actually my first foray into writing about anything occult or magical. And it was a song about these shared dream experiences and telepathic experiences my girlfriend Lisa and I were having at the time. And on the first North American tour, when Blondie was the support act for Iggy, David Bowie was the incognito keyboardist on the tour, on his tour. And it turned out that we were having the same kinds of dreams. And whenever one of us wanted to call the other one was just about to call that one, And this was back in the day where you had to be at a particular place at a particular time to make a phone call, not unlike today. And so I wrote the song about being in touch with her presence. And so this was like my first, foray or essay into writing about this kind of stuff. And so that was a big hit in the UK and in Europe, not so much in the States for Blondie. And so I earned quite a bit of money from that. So I had the great good fortune of being able to live off my royalties for a while. And one of the things I did in 1983, I had already got involved in the Gurdjieff work in New York in my last days there. And I had read a lot about it through Colin Wilson's work, but also others. And I became quite interested. This Russian writer named P.D. Uspensky, who's best known as like Gurdjieff's kind of most eloquent spokesman, but he actually was a brilliant writer and philosopher in his own right and all that. So I enjoyed his books, and I got a lot from them. And so I finally decided, again, like with the Crowley thing, well, let's check this out. And through one thing led to another, someone I knew was already involved in one of these this called the Gurdjieff Foundation, which is the real thing. It's the real McCoy. There's lots of bogus groups out there, but this is the real foundation that started up after Gurdjieff's death, sort of in the early 1950s. And so I got involved in New York there for a while. And then when I moved to LA, I got involved there. And with a friend who was in it too, we decided to go on this European adventure in the summer of 1983. And I subsequently called it my mini search of the miraculous, that was the name of one of Uspensky's books. It was Uspensky's book about his time with Gurdjieff. And so we went to places like Stonehenge and Chartres. And then on my own, I went to Glastonbury Hill that rises out of the flatland of Somerset, and there's this ruined tower at the top of it. And it's supposed to be. I was very much into earth magic at the time, ley lines, stone circles and megaliths and things like that. And these were supposed to be places that was a kind of telluric energy. This earth energy was collected and spread out in these kind of lines, and different places were connected in these kind of straight lines. So there would be a burial mound or a stone circle or a church or something else. And so I dutifully got what was called an ordnance survey map of this area that I was going to be in eventually on in Cornwall. And there should be. And so I went to some of the the well-known ones, and then sought out these other ones. But the other thing, the pilgrimage I made on this particular tour was this to meet Colin Wilson, because he lived in a little place called Gorin Haven, which is a tiny fishing village in the far west country here called Cornwall. So I went there, and I had already read quite a few of his books. It's a book, The Occult, and then his most famous book, his first book, The Outsider, which was not about the occult at all, anything like that. It's about existentialism. It's about these. I mentioned this term outsider earlier, and say, well, yeah, there's that, but then there's this other way in which I relate to it, and it's these sort of individuals who, for Wilson, have a kind of craving for meaning and purpose that the secular modern world can't provide, and they find themselves outside of society, and some are crushed from that. Some come to terms with it, and some are able to break through into levels of creativity where they transcend all of the conflict and create works of art that inform the society and all that sort of thing. And it was a big hit for him. It's his first book when he was 24. And I mean, I subsequently wrote a book about him, a life called Beyond the Robot: The Life and Work of Colin Wilson. And his own life story is a fantastic success story. And it's like rags to riches to rags, because he worked like 10 years learning how to write. And then this first book of his came out, The Outsider, and it was a surprise bestseller. In the summer of 1956, this book about tortured geniuses and alienation and existential angst and all that suddenly was on the bestseller lists. And he was this he hadn't gone to university. He had worked all these sort of menial jobs, living like a hobo. He was sleeping. There's this wonderful open patch of countryside here called Hampstead Heath in the north of London. And its hills are probably much like they were when Keats and Constable tramped over them 2 centuries ago, and such and such. But at one point, Wilson was sleeping there in order to avoid paying rent. And he had a bicycle, and he would cycle down to the British Museum, and at the time had the famous reading room, and he would spend all day there writing and all that. So he had this kind of romantic bohemian, and this is around the same time as the Beats and all that. So any case, I read this book, and I completely identified with it and all that. And then I sought out all his other books, and then finally made this pilgrimage to where he lived, and spent the day there, really, just and an evening in which we got drunk on a couple bottles of wine, and he explained his ideas about consciousness to me. And I knew at the end of the night I had nailed them. Yes, I got it. But the next morning it all dissipated like fairy dust. And what did he mean by that? Back on the train, that gave me food for thought, along with the hangover back on the train onto London. But we kept up a correspondence after that. And I mean, he even at one point, I was working at a New Age bookshop in Los Angeles in the late 80s and early 90s called the Bodhi Tree. It's not there anymore, but it was quite well known in its day. And I was house sitting for one of the owners, and who they had this fantastic, I call it a Zen castle in the Hollywood Hills, like 3 floors, and there's a terrace garden and a jacuzzi and all this fantastic stuff. Long story short, he was in town in California for a while to give some lectures, and I said, "Why don't you come stay here?" So even stayed when I was house sitting in this fantastic place. So we got, we had a fairly close relationship and all that. And so, but that was fantastic for me to go and do that, and to make this pilgrimage, and to get to know him, and to get know his family, and but then also to go to these places like you mentioned, going to the site of Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, which he had in the 1920s in Fontainebleau outside of Paris. And 100 years ago would have just about kind of been running down about 100 years ago now. I mean, he held on to the actual building, this old chateau, in the Fontainebleau forest. But the institute, or what he called the institute, it's even a question, was there really an institute? In the sense of some kind of official thing, but in any case, I'd gotten involved in the work, and I was very, very interested in the history of it. I subsequently wrote 2 books about people involved in it. I wrote a book about Ouspensky, and another fellow named Maurice Nicoll, who, interesting character, started out as a Jungian. He was Jung's British lieutenant here in the late 19-teens into the early 1920s, but then he attended a lecture by Ouspensky, and then he jumped ship, and he became a student of Ouspensky's, and then spent most of the rest of his life teaching the work as well. So although I'm not involved in it now, and haven't been for many years, and I'm not teaching it or associated with the people who are, I've been very, very interested in the history of it, and the people involved in it. So I have written 2 books about that. But no, I mean, that was, I got some remarkable things happened when I was involved in it. I tell some of the stories in the books, but that I got more out of that, let's say, than I did out of the time I spent in the Aleister Crowley fan club.
Well, that is absolutely a way to put it, and just catching me off the back foot. Do you mind if I ask you a little bit more about your relationship with Colin Wilson, and how that influenced your understanding of individuation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the outsider has the task of becoming who he or she is, which is that's a nutshell. Jung's individuation is the same sort of thing, and it's something that goes back. Nietzsche says it as well: become who you are. And it goes back to Pindar, the ancient poet. So it's this whole notion of well, and again, in another way, I quote from the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where this wonderful saying says, "If you bring forth what is within you will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you." So you have no choice. So you have this potential, whatever you want to call it, this something that needs to grow and emerge, and So Colin talked about it in these certain kind of challenges that characters that he called the outsider face. So it's less a kind of psychological system with Jung, because this particular the encounter with the shadow and anima or animus or something like that. So there is a kind of growth trajectory. But with Wilson, it's more existential. It's more about being, let's say, or something like that. So he came out of Sartre and Camus and Heidegger and all that, the search for being. This is, we suffer from Seinvergessenheit. The Germans are great. They just get Seinvergessenheit. Forgetfulness of being, which is the same thing that Gurdjieff says. We don't remember ourselves. We're asleep or we're mechanical. So the Seinfrage, the being question. How do we experience our being? How do we experience ourselves authentically? So that's that context. And although, I mean, one of the things that makes many things that makes Wilson's first book, The Outsider, historically interesting is that he's one of the first people to actually write about Gurdjieff outside of the people that were involved with Gurdjieff. So in the last chapters in The Outsider, he includes Gurdjieff in after writing about Bernard Shaw and Alfred North Whitehead and something like that. And he basically says that Gurdjieff's system seems to be the most complete sort of existential philosophy, in the sense of like he's trying to put into practice disciplines that would somehow create the sense of being, self-remembering, one of them, or a variety of different ways to combat the mechanicalness, the growth of essence rather than personality, which I guess you can equate with sort of persona and self in the Jungian. I mean, you can line these things up. Well, yeah, that's similar. That's similar. You can. That's a fun thing to do. You can. And it's all. And to me, that always makes it seem like, well, it's about something. If they're using different language and talking about the same thing, but in different ways, sometimes very different ways, sometimes only slightly different ways, they're all talking about the same kind of thing in a general sense. And you could more or less distill these things. There's like a perennial philosophy in terms of religion. You could probably get a kind of comparative esoteric psychology where it would be like a kind of here's like the basic kind of outlook of what we seem to be working with here. But Wilson, it was about the challenges that the outsider faces in order to realize his potential, her potential in a world that doesn't pay any attention to him. And there's a variety of pitfalls and challenges. And it's mostly the outsiders having to overcome their own sense of sort of self-pity and not blaming the system. So Wilson, in the early days, Wilson got in a lot of trouble here because he was associated with a group of writers known as the Angry Young Men. And he wasn't particularly angry, but they were angry. They were like socialists, put it like that, or social critics. Look Back in Anger, John Osborne, if you know that play. Alan Stillitoe, the loneliness of the long distance runner. So it's like a social issue, the welfare state. And Wilson, he wasn't interested. He came from a working class background. He slept in Hampstead Heath. He worked as what they call a navvy, as just like physical labor. He was a porter in a hospital. He was a dishwasher, and so he worked at all these menial jobs. So he knew the working class world and all that. But he wasn't. His outsiders weren't these social outsiders, social misfits. They were people seeking a kind of higher, more intense kind of life more abundant, like the more abundant life that the Gospels speak of, although it's not necessarily from this gospel point of view that he was approaching it. But there was like this more intense being, which really what he was interested in. And they just thought this was like old-fashioned religion or something. Why aren't you writing about, the struggle of the whatever, class consciousness or something like that. But that's where he, and he was like the first positive existentialist, because rather than accept the kind of rather grim, dreary vision of human existence that Sartre, has, it's, man is a useless passion. Or even Camus. I mean, we're supposed to see Sisyphus happy, but I mean, can you really? How's it going, Sisyphus? Oh, life has its ups and downs. Camus maybe because he had a great love of nature, and he was young and athletic. Where Sartre was like, he was ugly and half blind, and nature was this horrible sticky thing that was going to suck him down into it and all that. So, he had a very different. I mean, I don't know if you know the story about Sartre's bad mescaline trip. He experimented with mescaline in the 30s and had a bad trip. And if you know his novel Nausea,
Mhm.
where the character is like terrified by the root of a chestnut tree, or there's a doorknob and he doesn't know what it is in his hand and things like that. All this weird trip that Sartre had. He had like lobsters were chasing him down the Champs Elysees, and orangutans are looking in his window, and all this kind of stuff. So it translated into this vision he had of reality. And Wilson admired Sartre's rigor in his thinking, and he's always very good at undermining self-deception, bad faith, and all that. But he didn't accept this kind of rather grim view of the world. And he said, what about the kind of ecstatic vision like a William Blake, or Nietzsche, when the idea of the eternal recurrence came to him, and he said he was 6,000 feet above man and time, and all these kind of positive visions, not syrupy love necessarily, but intense kind of visions of intensity and all that kind of thing. So he wanted to develop an existential philosophy that would include those. And he went back to the root. He actually went back to Husserl, Edmund Husserl, who's one of these fantastically unreadable, German philosophers, but out of whose notion of phenomenology, the kind of precise description of phenomena, and phenomena is everything, to the things themselves. Let's forget about whether they're real or not, or whether we can trust the senses or not. Let's just describe what is in consciousness. Let's describe sort of a thumbnail sketch of that. But Wilson took that kind of discipline and applied it to sort of mystical experiences, and then later paranormal experiences in the occult and stuff of that sort. So I mean, that was I just found all that fascinating, and it was actually this whole body of ideas were persuasive. They were very persuasive, and I came to see that I could understand a great deal of my own experience in terms of the ideas that he was like spelling out.
Gary, could you talk a little bit about your exploration for a theory of consciousness?
People always ask me, do I have one of my own? I don't know if I have one of my own. I mean, I've tried to understand what all these other guys have said and how that makes sense, and I kind of put those together. So in that sense, I mean, well, I would say in one way, yes. I mean, my big book, this book called The Secret Teachers of the Western World, it came out about 10 years ago, and it's a synoptic overview of the history of the West, intellectual history from the esoteric sort of point of view. So it's the alternative tradition, or the counter tradition to the mainstream. I mean, what we consider mainstream in many ways, it was blended back in the day, but from say Descartes on, and the Enlightenment on, this particular kind of approach to understanding the world, became dominant. But I look at this history through two lenses. One is the lens of, I don't know if you know Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which came out in like 2009. And it's a book that reboots the right and left brain conversation that had kind of petered out in the late 80s, because most hard neuroscientists said, well, we used to think, one brain did the other, but they seem to be doing the same things, and we don't really understand why we have two brains. And all these New Agers and pop psychologists are talking about right brain artists, left brain scientists, and we don't want to be associated with that riffraff. So let's just forget about it. So they couldn't figure out why, they had two brains. It didn't seem to be an interesting question to them anymore, so they just forgot about it. But then McGilchrist rebooted it by saying it's not so much what the brains do, it's how they do it. And in simplest terms, the left brain is a microscope and the right brain is a telescope. The left brain works by focusing with pinpoint accuracy on a very small patch of reality and getting it in ultra, crisp clarity. And it's that brain that we use in order to maneuver through the world and break it up into bits and pieces, which we can easily manipulate, and so on and so on. The right brain is about isness. So in a book, it's with the publisher now, and it won't even hear anything back from them about it until next year. a contrast to two. Say if the left brain takes care of business, the right brain takes care of isness. And we go back to the German again, and Meister Eckhart, Istigkeit. Istigkeit is we don't have this in English. We're being, which it's too it doesn't have the kind of concrete, but Istigkeit, the very isness of something. It was that isness that scared Sartre, but it was the same isness that delighted Aldous Huxley on his mescaline experience. So Huxley had a good trip, and the reality that was scaring the hell out of Sartre was like, oh my God, the flannel in my trousers. This is like transcendental. He was like completely transfixed by it. What happens when you take that and any wine or anything else like that is it sort of puts the left brain, hyper alert left brain, to sleep a bit. And all the reality that it has hitherto kept out of the picture because it was unnecessary in order to deal with things comes in. So suddenly something that before you had the glass of wine or took the drug, whatever it was, just was whatever it was. Suddenly there's this strange aura radiating from it of oh, it's interesting now. And what's interesting is like this, it's not necessarily a sensory reality that's been cut out, but it's this other something that we don't have a language for. Isness, meaning, whatever you want to call it. But suddenly something that seemed every day and not worthy of too much attention, now it's like you're looking at it and it's like you're transfixed. And so, I mean, the poetry, is in those poetic moments, we see something in that way. And what we're seeing it not in terms of the left brain's maniacal need to deal with things and put everything into categories. So it's in Sartre's novel, what happens to him is the categories that he's used to having in order to order things: tree, cloud, bird, pool, water, bench. Those things they slide off. They're like labels that don't stick to things anymore, and the glue's off them, and they're sliding off. And he's seeing this thing, and he I know if you were a kid, I used to do this. I used to say a word over and over again until it just was some sound coming out of my mouth, and it had no meaning anymore. And it was a really weird kind of thing to do. But this is what happens to them. But this is also what, in some ways, but in a positive way, all of that kind of order is kind of muffled or negated, and just the sheer isness of these things come out. They're just and how to say it, we don't have a language to talk about this. So, I mean, I'm what I would say what we would need in some way is some middle ground, so that you're not overwhelmed by the isness of things, as Huxley was taking the mescaline. And he even says, if everyone took mescaline like this, there'd be no war, but there wouldn't be any civilization, because no one, would want it. Because what he said, he had no inclination to do anything. The left brain constantly wants to do something, got to deal with stuff and and that's why we're all workaholics. But the right brain's like, do. And talking about the 60s goes back to the famous Human Being that happened in 1966 in San Francisco in the Panhandle section. With all the hippies gathered, and this is when LSD had just been made illegal, and so they had this big event to kind of, the beginning of the alternative society, as it were, the official beginning of the counterculture. But there was one bit where they had one politico there. I think it was Jerry Rubin. I don't know if it's Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman. I forget which one right now. But he was haranguing them about the social action they needed to do and how they needed to protest the war and all that. And after a while, they said, man, we're here to be. We don't want to do anything, man. And so the right brain is like, or I'm aging myself. You probably don't know. There's an old television show in the early 60s called Dobie Gillis. And there was one character who was a beatnik. It was Maynard G. Krebs. There's a guy who later played in Gilligan's Island. Sorry, but his joke was always, someone would say, Maynard, why don't you find some work? Work? You're like, work. So the right brain is like, I don't do anything. I'm happy, And Huxley even said, he would never want to wash the dishes that were in the sink when he was on mescaline, because they just look too beautiful, to do anything about. So Mrs. Huxley would have to deal with this. Yeah. But but I'm saying this is so some middle ground between the two. So we're not overwhelmed, and our will is inhibited, but not so we numb or muffle that extra something content, whatever meaning, whatever you want to call it, so that we agree with Sartre that we live in a meaning, and not even Sartre, like famous scientists tell us all the time that it's human life is a small island of meaning in a vast meaningless universe. And I would say that sounds like isn't it an unscientific statement? Is that a falsifiable? Can you falsify that statement, whether the universe is full of meaningless? You can't. So they just say that, and so we just assume that's the case, and I don't think it's too far-fetched to say so many of the problems that we face in the world or because we don't see the meaning that's there already. We take the world as something just to use and manipulate, and we take people as something to use and manipulate and all that now. And in many ways I would say one example of this is being spelled out in my old homeland across the waters, which I won't go into too much detail about, but very to some sense in which this kind of ruthless, just exploitative consciousness is really come into power. And so I look at this history of in secret teachers of secret teachers of the Western world, of the esoteric, through this kind of civil war that McGilchrist says has been going on between the two brains. So for most of our history, they kind of work, well, as I would say, they work through how the U.S. government used to work, through systems of checks and balances. one part of the government would mitigate the excesses of the others, and such and such and such, right?
Oh, it'd be nice to see that again.
Keep the faith, baby. Keep the faith. So the two brains, so if the left brain got out of hand, the right would somehow, and McGilchrist spells this out in historical terms and where this happens and all this kind of stuff. It's a fantastic book. It's a fantastic read. And but he says, since about the Industrial Revolution, the left brain has gained a kind of dominance, and it's been busily recreating the world around it, the natural world, in its own image. And what it likes to do best is to turn something strange into something that it already knows. It likes to turn everything into something it can manipulate, and it doesn't like the strange. It doesn't like the new. It doesn't like the unknown. It likes to turn everything into something that it's familiar with, and it really likes cogs and wheels. And I guess these days it would be bits and zeros and ones and things of that sort. And so there's less and less of anything for the right brain to just sort of presence the isness of that isn't that kind of world. So you walk out in the city, everything around you is something more and more created by this, and especially in big cities, and life is accelerated and all of that kind of thing. So I see at one point in the early 1600s, this is when the Hermetic tradition, which was prestigious, up until then, famous names. You had to actually have equivalent of a university degree in many ways to study the Kabbalistic sciences and the Hermetic sciences and all that. It loses its street cred. This happens because of humanist scholarship, which is just starting up. It realizes that this famous collection of texts called the Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermetic writing, which was believed to have been written by this character, Hermes Trismegistos, thrice greatest Hermes, way in the before time, the dawn of time. And everybody learned from him. Plato learned from him. Jesus learned from him. Moses learned from him. The Egyptians learned from him, and all this kind of thing. And he starts what's called the Great Chain of Adepts. And so he teaches a student, and that student teaches another, and that one teaches another, and then they all kind of sitting at the feet of the master, and so on and so on. So it's this humanist scholar who's reading these texts. He realizes the Greek that they're written in can't be a Greek from the time that they're supposed to have been written. It's a much later Greek. It's a Greek later than Plato. These are supposed to have been written before Plato. And by the way, if Plato learned so much from this guy Hermes Trismegistus, why does he never say thank you? Why is there never any kind of mention in any of the dialogues that I learned this from Hermes Trismegistus or something, and so on and so on. So it subsequently came out. No, these were written in around 200 A.D. in Alexandria, a pious fraud, perhaps, in some way to show that. Because there was a whole argument at the time to include this Hermetic writing in the body of the church, its official writings in Catholic kind of theology, because they saw many resonances between some of the ideas in these texts and Christianity. And again, I mentioned the perennial philosophy, so it's like similar. This was like the beginning of this notion of perennial philosophy, the idea that Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Islam, Plato, they all come from the same source, and this is because there were scholars in the church who recognized Plato was good. We want to keep Plato. We don't want to put Plato on the banned books list. We want to keep Plato. He was a challenge to the church. Aristotle was fine because they used Aristotelian logic to argue, theological points, but Plato sort of was an alternative. Although eventually there was, Christianity was Platonized. So, but once that happened, that these texts were considered to be, they didn't have this historical pedigree, of going back so far and forward, then they must just be a fraud. And so what had hitherto been a prestigious, tradition just lost its street cred. And I took that as an attack by the left brain on a right brain body of knowledge, because I considered the Hermetic tradition a body of right brain knowledge. It deals with it deals with things and in the sort of way that the right brain deals with things, in images and metaphors and symbols, in connecting to things, not analyzing things, synthesizing things, and a variety of other things like that. And so I kind of used McGilchrist's notion of a civil war between the two sides of the brain to explain how what had hitherto been prestigious is suddenly now woo-woo. And now it's even really considered, well, although I guess at different times it raises its head a bit and gets a bit more accepted in some ways.
Gary, as we kind of navigate our conversation to a close here, something I want to ask you, given that you're such a voracious reader, and for any of our listeners out there who plan on reading through your new book, they'll get to see just the amount of other material that you reference throughout. If there was a single book that you could kind of use to set someone up on their path, what would be your recommendation as a bit of a closing thought, even though I think I know what you're going to say?
Oh, God, it's a tough one. My first thought is read Colin Wilson's The Occult, but it's 50 years old, so it might seem a little dated for some people, but it is really a page.
It's still good, Gary. It's still good.
Yeah, it did it for me, and I think people, when they come across it, they say, yeah, this is remarkable. So yeah, try that, and if nothing else, it can set you off on all these other trails, following other things. Because that's what I did. I just started reading all the things that he referenced. So I didn't like all of it, but a lot of it, I said, oh yeah, this is great. Oh yeah, and then you just go off on your own, and you're finding out all this stuff that his initial kind of reference led you to.
Mm-hmm. And if not that, we just had a wonderful guest on, a little named Gary Lachman. They've probably heard of him, who has a wonderful backlog that they can also dig into.
And one coming out on hemispheric thinking, yes? That's the idea in progress?
I generally deliver my books ahead of time. And people ask me, how do you produce so much? And I say, necessity is the mother of production. Because I live from advance to advance. And although these days the advances are more like retreats, let me tell you. So they asked me, do you have any ideas? Well, I'll tell you, this book, it's about a strange experience I had during the first lockdown here in 2019. And I'll just say it was about my being surprised by the sun. So I'll let you take it from there.
Well, we're looking forward to picking it up once it's out. And I
Okay.
can't thank you enough for sitting down and joining us. I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Sounds good. It's absolutely my pleasure. And thank you once again for inviting me to be on.
Thanks, Gary.
Certainly. Thanks for joining us.